I would say hundreds of subjects that he's well versed in, and he does them all very well. He does a lot of historical people, but he has an eclectic mix of other things. He tells me that he has one on ice cream that he'd like to do here, and then we could serve ice cream, and I'm not sure I could convince George of that. At any rate, it's, as I say, my great pleasure. I give you Dave Robinson.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here again at the University Club. Can you all hear me okay? Is this a good volume? All right, great. Before I forget, if you don't mind silencing your cell phones, you don't have to turn them all the way off, but if you just put the volume all the way down so we're not interrupted in our discussion. And I'm very excited, I'm honored to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about the women's suffrage movement from the mid-1800s to 1920. And I'm passionate about this because I've known lots of people who just don't bother to vote. And the Orlando Sentinel just a couple weeks ago had an article about the apathy or the various excuses that people don't that they use to not vote. Oh, I'm too busy, it's too complicated, my one little vote doesn't matter, they're all corrupt, it doesn't matter, that kind of thing. Well, that's basically, to me, throwing your power away. And especially if you know this history, we're going to be talking about these women fought and struggled and persevered for over 74 years. And one of the fascinating things is today is November the 2nd, and it was on this very day, November 2nd, 1920, that was election day that year. It was on this very day, 88 years ago, that women around the country were all able to cast a ballot for the first time. So this timed out perfectly for our discussion today. So, our country was founded on principles of democracy, equal rights. We, separated from King George, the tyrant, to be able to govern ourselves 242 years ago. But women have only had the power to vote for now 88 years. And it was 242 years ago that the founding fathers decided to break away from English tyranny again to become an independent nation. So in 1776, we had our Declaration of Independence, where we stated all men are created equal. But what they meant were white men like themselves who were property owners. It would be another 90 years before men of color would get the vote, and then another 144 years before these men's wives, daughters, sisters, and mothers could get the vote as well. Gloria Steinem, in a documentary I saw, stated that pre-mid-1970s, history books, like high school history books on American history, usually gave one sentence to women's suffrage. And it usually stated that in 1920, women were given the right to vote. Well, that it was not given. It was, again, fought for, struggled for, with a lot of arduous, hard work. So, and the two of the main leaders in the first phase, starting in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, tragically, they dedicated their entire lives to this movement, their mature lives, and they didn't live to see it be ratified. So this is a story of incredible perseverance, commitment, determination, again, story of bravery, courage, a story of committed relationships and friendships and teamwork. And finally, also it's a story of how the fairer sex shouldered on, pushed, and persevered, and even faced imprisonment, beatings, and intimidation. So it's a story about how we should never take our privilege and our responsibility to vote for granted. So please, if you haven't already, please do vote this coming Tuesday. Okay, this film clip we're going to be seeing a little later on is from a great movie I want to recommend called Iron Jawed Angels. It's with Hilary Swank as one of the important leaders in the second phase, a woman named Alice Paul. And I'll be talking about this movie, but I highly recommend it. One little thing that I don't like is that they use like new age music in it, I think to make it more relevant, seeming to modern audiences. To me, it doesn't fit because everything else is very accurate historically for like the late teens in 1920. But it's a great movie. I highly recommend. Also, there's a great Ken Burns documentary called Not for Ourselves Alone. And it's a two-part documentary. It's very rich, very detailed, and largely focuses on Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So you have a handout. I'm not going to be able to go into detail about all of these incredible women leaders, but you've got the names, and I encourage you to Google and look up more, read more about all of these women. But I'll be mentioning the real highlights and going into a little detail on some of the really major leaders. So we trace the women's movement back to 1776 when Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband John. He was attending the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and in her missive she wrote, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." There's a wonderful exchange of letters between this couple, and she really was a great wife, great supporter. They obviously loved each other very much. And in his reply, you can almost picture him rolling his eyes because he's just like, yes, we're rebelling from Britain as we should, but we've kind of created an atmosphere of rebellion. We hear that schoolboys are rebelling against their schoolmasters. And now, are you going to tell me that you wives are going to rebel against us, your husbands? And so he didn't really take it very seriously. So our next major item is in 1787, the Constitutional Convention allowed each state to determine its own qualifications for voting. Only New Jersey gave women the right to vote. So there was one state at the very beginning. Another very important happening, it was in 1792, an incredible forward-thinking woman for that time, Mary Wollstonecraft. How many people know that name? And how many people have read her book on the vindication of rights of women? One, okay, one. That's often more than I ever see. And this is an incredible book about, of course, women should be allowed to have education like the males. Of course, women should be able to own property. Of course, women should be able to have custody of their children. Of course, women should not have to be subjected to beatings and marital rape. And it's very direct, very easy to read, and it's never been out of print. It's been very influential for all feminists, and this inspired later Virginia Woolf and Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan, and all the great feminists are well-versed. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft is more famous these days as being the mother of a famous author. Anybody know who that was? Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. And it was actually 200 years ago this year in 1818, that Frankenstein was first published. And has anybody read Frankenstein? It's not just a horror shock novel. It's very frightening, but it's actually a very meditative, philosophical book about taking responsibility for your actions, being mindful, being thoughtful of what you're choosing to do. So it's just not, horror quickie kind of stuff. So Mary Shelley was very much the daughter of her mother, though she never knew her mother. Her mother died giving Mary Shelley birth. So our next item is in 1807. The men in New Jersey decided to take away the vote for women. It was rescinded, so they only had that for 30 years. So during the early 1800s, there were several very strong independent women on their own who were seeing that there's injustices to women, and some of the laws, If a woman was being beaten or battered by her husband, and she got away from him, she abandoned her family. She had no rights to the children that she bore out of her own body. She had no rights to her clothing, even if she made her own clothing. She did not have rights to the clothing she escaped with. That was his property. He could demand, you give me that dress back. There were examples. Women would bring an inherited property, like for instance a whole farm, into a marriage. As soon as the marriage contract was signed, it's now her husband's property. Many injustices like this, and there were even in some states laws in the law books that a husband could beat his wife if he needed to bring harmony back into the marriage, as long as the cane or the stick was no thicker than his thumb. These are actual laws. So some incredible women, Frances Wright, Ernestine Rose, Lucretia Mott, Margaret Fuller, began to agitate. And I actually made a mistake on this. It says equal suffrage. It was actually more for equal rights for women. Actually, Lucretia Mott didn't believe in suffrage for women until a little later. She eventually would come on board with that. But they were mostly agitating for people to be thoughtful that women should have more rights and more say in their lives. So those are some of the unjust laws. Also in the early 1800s and 1830s, many anti-slavery groups were joined and some were even formed by women. Slavery was getting to be a hot button issue. So these abolitionist groups led many women to reflect on the societal and political limitations placed on them. Yes, these slaves had no rights, they have no power. Well, what rights do I have? There's a real, connection here. So women also were joining temperance societies, largely, and a lot of the temperance movement. And what is temperance? No alcohol, no drinking, no imbibing. Why would women be so interested in that as an issue? Yeah, domestic abuse. They saw a clear correlation between heavy drinking and domestic abuse, not only of the women, but also the children. And also money would be, spent up, burned up in alcohol, that kind of thing. So in 1838, Angelina Grimke, fascinating woman, I have to speak about her a little bit. She grew up in South Carolina in a wealthy plantation mansion where there was slavery. So she grew up compassionate, sensitive, and she regularly saw slaves beaten. And this bothered her. And she was given a slave as a birthday present. I'm given a person. This is a person. And she was very close to her older sister, Sarah. So when she got of age, she moved north to be with her sister, Sarah. The two of them converted to being Quakers. And so later, she was the first woman in the United States ever to address a legislative body. She testified before the Massachusetts state legislature basically about the horrors, the injustices of slavery. I've seen it. My father did it. And so she was even testifying against her own family. She then traveled on a lecture tour. This was unheard of. A woman traveling alone without a chaperone and speaking in front of crowds, mixed crowds. This was considered indecent. And so she was booed and heckled. Things were thrown at her like many of the suffragists would be later. But she persevered. She kept going. She had important things to say, and she began speaking more and more on feminist issues too. Okay, very important next thing. 1840, the World's Anti-Slavery Convention was held in London. Now, I need to talk about these two women that were restricted from participating. Two American women, Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker minister, and she was very involved in getting freedom for the slaves, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There in London, they became good friends. And the two of them, while they were in London, agreed to, they would work together to improve women's rights. I have to back up and tell you about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an incredible woman. She grew up the daughter of a wealthy judge. He had 10 children. All 5 of the boys died. four of them died like in early childhood, and then one lived to be 20, and father pinned all his hopes on the eldest boy. He would be able to inherit the property, run the family business, that kind of thing. There were 5 girls. They're all very healthy, and the boys kept dying. Finally, the eldest boy died at age 20. The father was devastated, and Elizabeth went to comfort him, and he's like, oh, honey, you're so bright and intelligent. If only you were a boy. If only you were a boy. So she determined, I'll do everything for daddy's approval. She studied hard. She found somebody to teach her Greek so she could learn Greek. Her father was impressed by good horsemanship. She learned to ride horses. She learned to jump 4-foot fences, all to get daddy's approval always. If only you were a boy. You know, there was something wrong with her by being female. Well, when she was a girl, she would sit in daddy's law office, and one day a widow came and said, this is totally unfair. I inherited my father's farm. When I married my husband, he then died, and he gave it to his son, my stepson. And he's not taking care of it. He's not giving me any income. I have nothing to live on, and it's my farm. And Judge Katie said, I'm sorry, you have no rights. It became your husband's property to do with whatever he wanted to. You have no rights here. Elizabeth couldn't believe it. The poor widow left. She goes, Daddy, that's totally unfair. Elizabeth, let me show you. Right here it is in the law books. And she goes, give me a scissors. I'm going to cut that bad law out of there. And he goes, honey, it doesn't matter. Wise men have written a lot of these books. You know, it's a law. You can't change it. And she thought, well, I might do something about that someday. So she had many adventures growing up. She's very intelligent, and she got very involved in abolitionism. Her uncle, Garrett Smith, was an ardent abolitionist, and his house was a station in the runaway Underground Railroad, thank you, Underground Railroad. So she was meeting runaway slaves, and she met some of the other big abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, and she loved going over there. Well, her father hated abolitionism, thought it was terrible. So she was hanging out more with her liberal uncle in that house, and then she fell in love with an abolitionist, Henry Stanton, and her father refused to consent, so they ran away. And she then married him. Oh, another story. When she was a young woman, and this I think is very important, she gathered some friends. They knew of a humble young man who wanted to go to ministerial school, but he didn't have the money. So she and her friends petitioned people, would you give to his schooling? We think he'd be a wonderful minister. She gave of her own money, collected funds. They got him through ministerial school. He graduated. He didn't have a church. They said, we'll pull strings so you could speak at our church, so you'll have your first sermon. And they bought him a suit. His first sermon, my sermon today is on the inferiority of women, that women must not speak in the church. Well, Elizabeth and her friends all stormed out. You can imagine the sense of betrayal. So back to her marriage. She's run away with Henry Stanton, and she goes, honey, I love you, but I'm not going to be Mrs. Henry Stanton. I'm going to join my names, be Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He's like, okay. And she goes, and when we do our vows, I'm not saying I obey. He's like, okay. He was kind of a liberal guy, so they got married. It was a pretty much happy marriage. And then 2 days later, they went to this big convention, the first World Anti-Slavery Convention. They get there. She's all excited. Lucretia Mott is there. She meets Lucretia Mott. And they get there, and they're like, okay, women are not allowed to be a part of this. You may listen behind the screen, behind a curtain, but this is for men only. We sailed for a week to be here. What are you saying? And Lucretia Mott is a major abolitionist in America. We're sorry, you can listen, but you're not allowed to speak or be seen, not even be seen. So other abolitionists, men joined the women in protest. So Katie Stanton and Mrs. Lucretia Mott, they went to the History Museum one day while they were in London, and they had so much to talk about. They sat down on the steps, and they never did go in the museum. They had so many shared ideas, and they both became passionate. We can do something. We need to do something about all this injustice in America toward women and what we just experienced. So that later that same year, no, I'm sorry. Now we're jumping 8 years later. They made this pledge, and in July of 1848, years went by. Elizabeth started having babies, one baby after another. She's writing letters back and forth to Lucretia Mott, but they don't have really time to do anything. And then in July of that year, Lucretia Mott comes to visit Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth is living. And come and have tea at the house where I'm living. Elizabeth says, I can't wait. I've been having babies. I'm bored to death. I'm mentally starving. Can't wait to talk to some other intelligent women. So they go, and they're talking about all these injustices. And Elizabeth says, okay, we're having this big gripe session, but let's do something. Let's have a convention. There's never been a convention for women's rights. And they organized this. It happened 5 days later. Isn't that amazing? Elizabeth said, we can make it happen. I know of a church. They'll probably let us use it, the Wesleyan Church. We'll take out an ad. Well, it's so late, we might only get 30 people. Well, it's a start. Let's do it. So they took out this ad. 5 days later, they thought they might get 30 people. 300 showed up, carriage after carriage. And Elizabeth was like, see, there's a lot of people like us. And so when they were deciding what they were going to talk about, they wrote this Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, and Marianne McClintock was among the 5 women that organized this. And Elizabeth said, we have to make suffrage one of the items. Equal rights for women mean equal right to vote. And Lucretia Mott herself is like, oh, that might be too soon. Let's just talk about property rights and rights to children first, and maybe we could get there. And Elizabeth said, we can maybe change some laws, but then they can be changed back again if women don't have the power to vote. Remember the Declaration of Independence. It was all about no taxation without representation. And we have working women, single working women that are being taxed, and they're not represented. And so she talked them into this, being on this proposed Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. It was patterned after the Declaration of Independence. It said all men and women are created equal. And so Frederick Douglass, her old friend, abolitionist friend, a former slave who's now a famous orator and abolitionist himself, he is there. So they are discussing this, and Elizabeth says, okay, ladies, here you can talk. We know in a lot of churches, a lot of public places, you're not allowed to speak. We want you to speak. So people are like, oh, asking for the vote, and Elizabeth's like, we're not going to ask. We're demanding it. We're going to demand it. And, well, it's too soon, maybe later on down the line. And Frederick Douglass came up and said, I'm not only for equality for slaves, but for all people. I think Mrs. Stanton is right. So it passed, and 100 people willingly signed the declaration out of the 300 attendees. This was the first time a convention by an organized group effort to promote women's suffrage was held, and it got national attention. This was so radical, so different. Nobody had done anything like this, that the word spread throughout New York, hit all the papers, and got spread around other states. And just a few weeks later, another women's rights convention is held in Rochester, New York. Among those leaders are Amy Post and Abigail Bush. And then there were more in New York, and then around New England, then the Midwest. It spread like wildfire, and the women were saying, yes, there's a lot of women feeling like things have to change. So in 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Mass., and it was organized by men as well as women. And the convention then would be held annually for the next 11 years until it was disrupted by the Civil War. Among some of the famous people during those 11 years were Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and Susan B. Anthony, just among some of the few of the famous speakers. Sojourner was a black woman slave, freed, who reinvented herself. She was illiterate. She couldn't even read or write, but she was a strong 6-foot-tall woman with a booming voice, a lot of inner fire, and she's like, I'm going to rename myself Sojourner, like I'm going to travel, I'll just walk if I have to, and I'll charge a little money, and I'm going to tell the truth like it really is. So at one of these conventions, a man got up and said, now you ladies, this is a bunch of tomfoolery. You don't really want to vote or have equal rights. I mean, after all, are men going to be willing to hold your chair at the table? Will they be willing then to open the door for you when you come in the house? Will they be willing to assist you up in the carriage? Now think about this, ladies. So Sojourner takes the lectern and she's like, nobody's ever helped me into a carriage. Ain't I a woman? Nobody's ever opened the door for me. Ain't I a woman? Nobody's held my chair at the table. Ain't I a woman? And I have toiled the fields from sun up to sundown. I have planted, I have plowed, I have hoed, I've harvested. Ain't I a woman? And famous speech by her. So then in the early 1850s, Elizabeth Smith Miller, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's cousin, invented a reform costume for women. The garment was long baggy trousers worn under a short skirt that only came to the knees, and it was designed to give women freer movement. How she came upon this was she went mountain climbing with her husband and knew she couldn't wear these long skirts and the corset and all that and be able to do this activity, and somebody there at this resort said, oh, we do have a woman's climbing costume. It's kind of Turkish in design, and it was basically what would become known as the bloomer. So how it got to be known as the bloomers, Amelia Bloomer had a newspaper, a feminist newspaper called The Lily, and she promoted it. She had a drawing of it, and then women wrote in saying, can I get a pattern? I want to do this too. These are very popular for a while. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the other suffragists wore them, but then they saw that people would come to heckle them and just to see this funny outfit rather than listen to the message, listen to what they were saying. So it kind of went by the wayside. They were originally known as a Turkish costume. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she kind of was sorry to let it go because you could move so much more easily. And imagine wearing all those long layers of skirts and petticoats and the corset. How could you move? And women had accidents. They'd fall downstairs. They'd trip on their own hems. And imagine the work, because these skirts trailed dirt and dust and mud, all the washing that had to be done. And they were, so confining and imprisoning, just the average outfit. So it was in 1851 that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met on a street in Seneca Falls. At this point, Susan B. was more interested in temperance and abolitionism. And now I have to tell you about her background. She grew up a Quaker in a relatively large family. And the Quakers, the reason Lucretia Mott was so forward-thinking, is that they saw women as equal in the eyes of God. This was very unusual. So there were women Quaker ministers. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker minister. And Susan B. Anthony had an aunt that regularly led services in her Quaker meeting house. And women were part of the discussion. They would debate things, and they were all Quakers were just very embroiled in the slavery issue. Slavery was an evil, and all Quakers boycotted cotton clothing and sugar cane, anything that slaves would be part of the production of. So she, as a girl, she experienced sexism. There was this Quaker schoolhouse, and she finished her work quickly. She was very bright. And the advanced boys got to do higher math problems. So she's like, teacher, could I work some of those problems? I'm done with my work. And he goes, they'll hurt your brain. They're for boys. And there used to be this attitude that women couldn't handle too much education. It would make their brains explode or cause them brain damage. I mean, and there are articles like written about this. So she complained to her father. Her father pulled all the children out of the school, and he homeschooled them. So she became a teacher herself and taught for 10 years, like in a one-room schoolhouse. The parents said, oh, you're much better than your predecessor, that man that used to teach here. Oh, you're so great with the kids. They're learning. They're excited. Then she found out she was making 1/4 of what her predecessor had made, the man had made. And this kind of made her discouraged. Around this time, her father needed her back home to help run the farm, and she was very good with economics and everything, so she went back to help her father. And at this point, her father's farmhouse was a meeting ground for Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, William, there was a famous man with 3 names, I'm blanking his name now. But anyway, all these leading abolitionists were there, and they were having fiery discussions, and they were also talking about the importance of the temperance movement. So Susan thought, could I make a career out of being a reformer? There's all these things that need to be done. And I'm intelligent. I could speak well. Maybe I could do this. So she went to Seneca Falls to go to a temperance meeting, met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They clicked immediately, and they started writing letters back and forth and visiting one another's houses. So they pledged that they would work together as much as they could to bring advancements to women. So Susan would often go to Elizabeth's house. Elizabeth had 7 children. Her lawyer husband was often gone. He was not there for the birth of any of his children. And Elizabeth was taking care of the house and all these little kids. So Susan would come help Elizabeth with the housekeeping so Elizabeth could write. And Elizabeth was the better writer, putting words together, doing speeches, but Susan could travel. She was single. She chose to be single. She did have suitors, but she saw matrimony as kind of an enslavement. So she was willing to travel, to do speeches, and Elizabeth was a good writer. So Henry Stanton, Elizabeth's husband, later said, Susan stirred the pudding, and Elizabeth stirred Susan, and then Susan went out in the nation and stirred up the country. You know, these new ideas. So Susan traveled tirelessly around the country for the rest of her life, and the press initially was horribly cruel. She was kind of a plain woman, and being a Quaker, she always wore her straight hair back in a severe bun, and she had these glasses whenever her eyes were crossed. And so when this radical woman coming to talk about equal rights for women and women should have the vote, what did they focus on? Her appearance. This plain, hatchet-faced woman. So ugly, she can't even get a man. So no wonder she's bitter and talking about these things. It's that kind of tone. Later, this would change. She was so perseverant, kept at it for decades, that the press learned to love her. And she would be described in glowing terms toward the end of her life. So, they did then in the before the Civil War, in New York State, they started having some good reforms that were more favorable to women. There were new laws that women could keep property that they brought into a marriage. If it was their property, they could claim that as their own if they filled out the right documents, and that would be theirs. It wouldn't be automatically her husband's. And women could start having control their own earnings. If women were making money, they could keep the money for themselves. So these were some advancements, and huge advancements. Well, then the Civil War broke out, and Susan was against everybody else. William Lloyd Garrison was that male abolitionist. He had a newspaper called The Liberator as a leading abolitionist, and he was very much a part of their suffrage movement too at this point. And so they all said, okay, well, we're in war now. We need to focus on this. So we won't have the annual women's conventions till the war's over. We'll put everything aside on the back burner. And Susan said, no, that's like saying our cause isn't as important. It is as important. And, we've got some momentum going. We don't want to lose that now. And everybody else, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said, no, we'll seem unpatriotic. we've got to get through the war first. And Susan disagreed, and she was right. When they stopped agitating government, the New York legislators chipped away at those laws that they had so recently advanced. So those started going to the back. And then during the latter part of the war and just after the war, Anthony and Stanton were asked, can you gather, through your women's groups, can you gather signatures for petitions saying, we support emancipation? Freedom for the slaves. So they wrote letters. They had their own newspaper called The The Revolution at that point. And some women thought that was too strong to call their women's newspaper Revolution. And Katie Stanton, well, what do you want to call it? Rosebud. She always. So they had this Revolution newspaper. And, okay, please send, we're sending out petitions. Go around your areas, collect petitions. Names, that you support the emancipation. This will lead to our rights. And when Susan was arguing with the other suffragists, they were like, we'll work the war effort, and then the men will be so grateful to us. Susan thought, yeah, right. So anyway, so they did this, and they, through this huge, big, mass effort, collected 400,000 signatures. This was the biggest group of names signed to one cause ever in the country up to this point. It was huge. And when they delivered this to the senator who asked for it, he's like, you've done a noble work. You women have done great things. We can't thank you enough. So we had the 13th Amendment, granted freedom to slaves in the Confederacy, but not through the whole country. And people, well, that's wrong. So then there was the 14th Amendment. So despite their focus on the war, many women did gain experience and organizational skills that they would later add to the suffrage cause. So just after the war, this is very important, thousands of organizations were formed around the country by newly emancipated black women. And these are very small little groups here and there, different local areas. Of course, there was no internet then. These black women were illiterate. It was against the law to educate slaves. So they were forming their own little groups, 3 or 4 or 5 people here, 3 or 4 5 people there, and they would all join in later in 1896 as the National Association for Colored Women. So the 14th Amendment was ratified, and Susan was out west visiting a brother, and she reads in the newspaper that it reads, a male citizen, all male citizens will have the right to vote. And her friend Elizabeth and William Lloyd Garrison is like, they're going to be so grateful. They're going to give women the right to vote too. And she's seeing, they're putting male in the amendment. So she immediately went back to New York, and we've got to change this. And that same year, 172 women in New Jersey tried to vote, but were denied. In the coming years, more and more women would commit similar acts of civil disobedience. So this got to be, they started having their conventions again, and this got to be very hotly debated. Stanton and Susan B. were saying, we have struggled. We were with you shoulder to shoulder to bring freedom to the slaves, and we've done that. And now you're going to give votes to the black males, but not to the women. And their male, including Frederick Douglass, said, this is the hour of the Negro. You need to be patient. This is an advancement. And then after this, we need to focus on temperance. And then the next generation will focus on you. What? They were outraged. They were furious. They were so angry that Elizabeth did something not very politically correct. In a speech, she said, okay, so you're willing to give the votes to Sambo, but not to women. Well, Sambo is like using the N-word today. Now, people have looked at that, she was really a racist, a classist. Actually, the whole speech, she's like, you're willing to give the vote to Sambo and Patrick, but not to Dinah and Bridget. So she was saying, you're giving the vote to uneducated people, illiterate people, with Bridget and Patrick, that meant, the foreign immigrant Irish, but not to women. At another point, somebody said, we are having to focus on the blacks now. And she goes, well, aren't half the blacks women? She was just for equal rights to everybody. So in no other place, none of their writings or her letters does Katie Stanton ever seem like a bigot or prejudiced. So now, why did the Republicans and Abe Lincoln's party, the Republicans who were behind these amendments, why do they want to give the vote to black men but not to women? This is actually a political strategy. They knew the black men would be grateful for their freedom, and now they can vote. So who are they going to vote for? Their liberators, the Republicans. Now, if the vote is given to everybody, then all these angry women in the South who no longer have their slaves and their lifestyles are totally changing, the vote could turn out very differently. And we're pretty sure that was all part of that strategy. All right, and it's interesting. There's a parallel in the early 1970s when the NOW movement, the National Organization for Women movement, was beginning. A lot of the women there had been shoulder to shoulder with the civil rights protest, and shoulder to shoulder with the anti-war, the Vietnam protest. Then they were like, okay, now it's our turn. And they were getting up to say, okay, now we want equal pay for equal work, and we want childcare. And the same men, their boyfriends and husbands, who they had supported in their causes, are saying, sit down, shut up, lesbos. And it's actually, there's a television newsreel, it's only come out in a documentary later, where these same young liberal men are saying, you just need a good effing. Really ugly stuff. And those women, like Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, felt very betrayed. So there was a split. So I lost my place. Stanton, they organized with Henry Blackwell, the American Women's Suffrage Association. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was the other side, the conservative, moderate side. And they formed their own group. The National Women's Suffrage Association. So now this great movement is split into two. A lot of the conservatives, like Lucy Stone, thought that Anthony and Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton were too radical. That same year, fascinating book, John Stuart Mill, a great English philosopher, and his wife published Harriet Taylor on the subjection of women that same year. And it's kind of along the same themes as Mary Wollstonecraft's book. In 1871, Victoria Woodhull addressed the House Judiciary Committee on the rights for women to vote under the 14th Amendment. And I probably should have had here, she was the first woman to run for president in 1872. But on the National Equal Rights Party, it wasn't a recognized major party, and she didn't get very far with that. Then that same year, 1871, the Anti-Suffrage Party was formed by wives of prominent men and highly supported by men and factory owners and businessmen who were employing poor women. They didn't want them to have the power to vote. They wanted to keep their wages where they were, and keep their hours the way they were, and that kind of thing. So in 1872, Anthony and 15 other women were arrested for trying to vote in New York. She marched up with her sisters and some friends to register to vote, and the men there were so taken aback, they're like, well, women can't vote. And she goes, I'm going to sue you. Actually, our state statutes say a citizen can vote, and I'm a citizen. Well, all right, here's the forms. And so they registered. Then she marched back and voted, and wasn't arrested there at the polls. A policeman came a couple weeks later, and she's like, okay, handcuff me. She wanted to make a show of this, and he didn't handcuff her, took her to jail. She had a trial, and the trial was a travesty. That's why I have it Stan's trial. Her lawyer tried to, she hired a lawyer, and he tried to make her points that the statutes, the state statutes say citizen, so she has her rights, and the judge just bangs the gavel, shuts up the lawyer, everything he tries to say, then pulls out a paper from his pocket that he had already prepared. And basically it's like, women are inferior, women have not the right to vote, blah, blah, blah. And then said, gentlemen of the jury, it wasn't a jury of her peers, it was all men, gentlemen of the jury, you're dismissed. The lawyer's like, no, it's supposed to be they're supposed to debate this. And bang, 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 court adjourned, and people were starting to agitate in the courtroom, and then the judge made a mistake. Miss Anthony, do you have anything to say in your defense? Oh, I have lots to say. And she did. She was prepared, and she was like, this is a travesty. It's supposed to be a jury trial. You didn't even let them hear the case, much less let them debate it. You dismissed them, and they didn't even talk amongst each and there was no arguments. It was just you. And she said, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. So she was fined $100, and she said, I will never pay a single cent of this. And she did not. Now, she was the only one who was brought to trial. Her sisters, some other friends also voted, but they were trying to make her the example. And I love that she demanded and received transcripts from the trial. Everything that was said, she made copies and she mailed them out to all the newspapers, would give them away to anybody who wanted one, just to show this terrible injustice. So 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed by Annie Wittenmeyer, and the WCTU became a powerful force in the struggle for women's suffrage. An interesting thing about that, a parallel to today, where, when people talk about more sensible gun legislation, there will be people, they want to take all your guns away. They want to take all the guns away. And so this temperance society, whenever there were meetings, there were people, they don't want you ever to be able to drink again. And these were largely people that had business interest in distillery companies or in taverns or things like that. They were making money. And so, they were trying to shut down the temperance union. 1878, Women's Suffrage Amendment is first introduced in U.S. Congress by Susan B. Anthony, and she would reintroduce this year after year for about 30 years. And 1880, this isn't on your sheet, Belva Lockwood was the first woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court. And in 1884, Belva ran for president with the National Equal Rights Party. Again, not a nationally recognized party. She didn't get very far, but she did try to run. In 1887, Anthony and Stanton wrote The History of the Suffrage Movement. Anthony hated it, but she knew it needed to be done, that this history needed to be set down. She wanted to be out there agitating, making speech, traveling, but okay, we gotta sit here and do this. 3 thick volumes already by that point. By the late 1800s, more and more women were now being able to get advanced degrees. Universities were opening up for women, and more universities were becoming co-ed. So more and more women, where it used to be they could not get an advanced degree, are, and now with modern technology, there are more working women working in factories and offices and other businesses. So then in 1890, the 2 factions that had split of the suffrage movement were reunited as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And they decided they would focus on state-by-state rights rather than try to do a big federal thing. By this point, Utah, Colorado, and I think a couple other, Wyoming, did give the vote to women. So now there are a few states out west that are allowing women to vote. In 1890, the Hull House opened, a settlement housing project in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. Within a year, 100 more settlement houses opened up. And these were wealthy women, educated women, who wanted to put their enthusiasm and their zeal to work for reform. Okay, well, let's open up a place where immigrant people or poor people could come and learn English, learn some skills, have some culture, things like that. provide childcare, and and these blossomed all over and gave a lot of young women a sense of direction. I can do something important. I can contribute to society. So this was major. In 1893, Hannah Greenbaum Solomon formed the National Council of Jewish Women, which got very involved in the suffrage movement. Controversial, again, 1895, Stanton published The Woman's Bible. And a lot of the suffragists distanced themselves permanently from her. They thought this was blasphemous. This was like being a heretic. And what it was actually was she had the help of 26 scholars, linguists, in Hebrew, and in ancient history, saying, the Bible's been interpreted and reinterpreted and recopied and reinterpreted over and over and over. What does the original source material really say? We highly suspect a lot of these verses or passages were put in later or reworded to push down women. And a lot of these scholars agreed. So it's actually a scholarly thing, but people saw it as, oh my God, she thinks she could rewrite the Bible now. Oh, what a terrible woman. In 1903, several women created the Women's Trade Union League to protect the rights of working women. More and more women, again, are working. And then in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party was the first national political party to adopt a woman's suffrage plank. Need to mention Stanton died at age 87 in 1902, and Anthony died in 1906 at the age of 86. Now, those are long lives. The life expectancy was only about 60 for women about that time. So they lived very long lives. They were very focused. And Anthony became beloved by the world. People didn't agree with her message a lot, but she was a powerful speaker. She never gave up. They said she memorized like the train timetable. She traveled around the country so much. She'd be like on a train, okay, I can make a connection over there, then get over to New York, then take a carriage there. And again, women did not travel, and women did not lecture. When she first started lecturing, people threw rotten fruit and rotten eggs on her, threatened her. One time she spoke, and the mayor had to have a loaded pistol on his lap and sit on the stage beside her. There were so many death threats. So she persevered through all this, and she became a beloved figure. She was known to the younger women as Aunt Susan. And her last speech, she was frail, she was weak, she'd always had a strong voice, and she had to be helped to the lectern. And she said, well, we haven't got there yet. We have been working at this for so long. I can't help but be discouraged. But looking out at all your faces, you younger women, the next generation, I am encouraged. Please remember, failure is impossible. And those were her last words in public. Failure is impossible. There's an AME church in New York that has a picture of her in a stained glass window with the words, failure is impossible. Okay, so that was the old way, the first wave of feminism, of the suffrage movement. Now we're moving into the second phase, the successful suffragists. 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the Congressional Union, which was renamed the National Women's Party in 1917. Excuse me, I just need to take a sip here. Alice Paul was also a Quaker. She had 5 different degrees, including a law degree. And these two women, kind of like Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, formed a great partnership, great devoted friendship. They met in England in jail, in a police station. They were both students over in England, and the Pankhurst women's suffrage movement was going on in England. And this was much more militant and radical. A woman named Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters were leading this, and they had tried petitions and doing speeches like Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and were getting nowhere. And so they kind of like reminiscent of our recent Supreme Court appointment, they would go into parliamentary meetings and they would shout and they would cause scenes to disrupt these parliamentary, women deserve votes, and they would resist being drug out, and they were arrested. And they had demonstrations and marches and pickets, things like that. And then they did, and I don't advocate this, they resorted to violence, but not physical human violence, but they smashed windows, they burned down buildings, some used acid to spell out votes for women on the men's golf courses, things like that. So an acid put in mailboxes of some of the parliamentary people. So Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were a part of all this. And one of the things that they did was they would jail these women, and the women were saying, we are not, we didn't commit a crime. So we're political prisoners. And they would go on hunger strikes. Well, then they would be force-fed, and the government didn't want deaths on their hands, so they would release the women, and then they would get arrested again, and they'd be in jail. They would go on hunger strike again. And Emmeline Pankhurst ruined her health from doing this. She did this so many times. Anyway, so Lucy and Alice brought some of those tactics, but not the violence. They didn't do any of these burning down buildings or breaking windows kind of things. In 1913, they staged a brilliant march on Washington. It was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So the town was already full of journalists from all over, people all over to see Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So the day before, 8,000 women marched with banners down the streets. And this got a lot of attention. Some of the women were attacked. There were mounted police, and they did nothing to intervene. And this got in the press. And Alice Paul made sure it got in the press. And, why can you talk to these policemen? Why did they not intervene? Women being attacked who are just, politely within their rights marching down the street with banners and things like that. So they tried various tactics, but then in January of 1917, members started peacefully picketing outside the White House gates. This went on for 2.5 years, 6 days a week, from sunup to sundown, and this involved 2,000 women. And in all weathers, freezing cold, through snow, rain, they would just stand there. They did not chant. They just stood still and held their banners. Now, this banner you see in this film clip, what they cleverly did was they used Woodrow Wilson's own quotes. So in this one, we shall fight for democracy, basically. We shall fight for democracy. Well, hello, what kind of democracy is it when half the population can't vote? This was their point. They did not hand out leaflets. They did not touch anybody. They just stood there, kind of saying, we are not going away. Well, this went along for a long time until the United States entered World War I. So Alice Paul and Lucy and some of the other leaders said, okay, do we desist now protesting? This will be seen as anti-patriotic, as attacking the president. And Alice was kind of like, well, maybe we should. And Lucy said, well, remember what happened during the Civil War. They did that, thought, oh, we'll be patted on the head, then they'll give us voting rights. We still don't have them. They gave the vote to black men, and we still don't have them. So Alice said, okay, we are going to continue the protest, but if you don't want to be out there, you don't have to. If you want to help in other ways, but you might have something thrown at you, you might be hit by somebody, this is going to rile people up. They knew it would. So they then started being arrested. People were attacking them, as we're going to see in this film clip, but they were the ones arrested for obstructing traffic. And they were not obstructing traffic. They hadn't been obstructing traffic for 1.5 years. They were just simply standing there exercising their freedom of speech and protest. So you're going to see now this film clip, and I'll tell you what happened after.
doesn't. He made you district commissioner. He's commander-in-chief now. Commander-in-chief doesn't get spanked by his money. Not with the whole world watching.
I'm sorry, miss, you're under arrest. All of you.
What? We were willing to press the charge. What? I'm talking to you. What is it? What's the charge? They've been arrested. Contact the family. Neighborhood end of the station. Call me when you get there.
If we want to hold them, we gotta charge them with something.
What? Obstructing traffic.
These arrests are purely political. The charge of obstructing traffic is political subterfuge. We know,
And I believe the court knows that President Wilson, his administration,
are responsible for our
are not
guilty of any offense.
We are
I will continue to plead for the political liberty of American women.
Where 16 of us face your
Where
judgment.
10 of us face your judgment.
Where 12 of us face your judgment today.
There will be 60 tomorrow.
I find these defendants guilty as charged of obstructing traffic in violation of the police regulations and the Act of Congress. $10 each or 60 days in the Occoquan workhouse.
To pay the fine would be admitting guilt. We haven't broken the law. Not $1.
60 days in Occoquan.
Okay. So kind of similar to Susan B's trial. Totally unjust, totally unfair, just not democratic at all. And so these women were put in jail. They refused to pay the fine. The thought was they'll pay the fine and they'll go home. One of the women at that parade, that march on Washington, was said, a man heckled her, yelled at her, "Go home to your mother." She said, "My mother's here." So, yeah, this was a huge mass movement. So they were put in this jail. The workhouse was terrible, the conditions. The food had worms and maggots in it. So Alice Paul then herself went on the picket line in front of the White House. She was arrested. They knew she was the ringleader. And so she was put in solitary confinement. They wanted to break her. She went on a hunger strike. And all the other women heard about it. They went on a hunger strike. They were force-fed then, held down, put in straitjackets, a tube put down their throats with raw eggs and milk forced down their throats. And they became very sick. They had sores on their mouth and their throats, their jaws, from this terrible punishment. And then besides that, there was the Night of Terror, November 17th. They were still not paying the fine. They would not eat on their own. So the warden said, okay, let's put on a little more pressure. So he told the guards, do whatever. And so there was what they called a Night of Terror, November 1917. Women were beaten, their heads banged up against the wall, dragged around, kicked. Lucy Burns, her hands were manacled over her head all night long. And all of this got out to the press. And this is what really turned the tide of public opinion. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, and some guards came forward to testify, yeah, this was happening, it's terrible. And I wasn't a part of it. There were women guards who testified about this. So they were finally released from prison, and appellate courts ruled that the arrests were totally illegal. And due to then the public outrage and all the bad press that he's getting, Woodrow Wilson then declared his support for women's suffrage. So for 2.5 years, these women had picketed, and they continued to picket even though he declared his support until June of 1919. The 19th Amendment then did pass the House and Senate, and but then it had to be ratified by 36 of the 48 then states. So some states already had voting rights for women. So this went around, and 35 states were ratified. One more state had to be. Several states refused to go into special session to vote on this. It came down to Tennessee. And the women were not very hopeful. Tennessee, oh God. Well, they got lots of women out there drumming up support, and it looked like the vote was going to be close. And the legislators, it looked like it was going to be 49 against to 48 for. So finally the day of the vote came, the arguments were made, and the youngest legislator was a man named Harry T. Byrne, and he had declared his opposition to this 19th Amendment, but he got a telegram right before he voted aye or nay. It's from his mother. His mother said, "Dear son, be a good boy. Vote yes." So it came to him, and he said, aye. And if you were in opposition, you wore a red rose. If you were for the amendment, you wore a yellow rose. So he did discard his red rose, and a woman gladly brought him his yellow rose. He went into hiding for several weeks after that. But it was finally passed. And unfortunately, it kind of took this public aware of violence against women, against protesters, to kind of turn the tide, to turn the president's own opinion. And that's a kind of a sad thing. And there's a parallel in the 1960s, when the civil rights protesters were protesting, doing peaceful sit-ins, doing peaceful marches, and then TV news cameras, you remember, show these young protesters being doused with high-pressure water hoses, where they're being slammed against the wall, being attacked by police dogs, and being beaten. And people seeing that on their home TV screens, oh my God, they just want an end to segregation. And a lot of that was about voting rights too. Blacks are getting the runaround to be able to register to vote or actually vote. So it's interesting, the parallels. In conclusion, Alice Paul and a friend, Crystal Eastman, wrote the Equal Rights Amendment way back in 1920. They didn't waste any time. It first introduced in Congress in 1921. And do we have a national Equal Rights Amendment to this day? No. It's been ratified 35 out of the necessary 38 states. So that's something we're still waiting for. An interesting thing I wasn't aware of until I saw this in a documentary. In 1971, the House and Senate did approve nationally funded child care for all, for women, working women. Part of the NOW movement was like, if we want to work, we have to do something with our children, and there should be a federally funded child care system. And that was approved, but Nixon vetoed it. And so maybe that will come back around. In 2 years, the 100th anniversary of the ratification, a new $10 bill is going to be introduced. And on the back of the bill will be pictures of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and some of these other, Alice Paul, Sojourner Truth, to commemorate all of their efforts to this great noble cause. Please vote. And as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony said, the true republic, men, their rights and nothing more, women, their rights and nothing less. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have time? Do we have time for questions?
Yes, I think we can take some questions if we have
I
any.
know that's a lot of information, and
Yeah.
I appreciate
And
it.
we did go over, but it was fascinating, David. Thank you so much.
So does anybody have questions?
Yes.
You said